Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Crime and Punishment recap series. In this video we're looking at the last theme for industrial Britain, which is the punishment of offenders, by looking at what change and continuity was there in the punishment of offenders. So in terms of executions then, they continue to be used for the most serious crimes, for example murder and attempted murder. However, it is during this time that you get huge changes to the way that we execute people, or the way that we used to execute people for their crimes. In the early modern period, we talked about the Bloody Code, which increased the number of crimes punishable by death and tried to make them as public as possible in order to send a message out to act as a deterrent to potential criminals. However, the downside to this was that there were often rowdy crowds who gathered on execution days. So, for example, factories would shut down and executions would often be the sites of lots of other types of crimes like theft and drunkenness, because it was kind of treated more like a bit of a holiday, a day out. So the government are worried about this rowdy behaviour, so they outlaw public executions in 1868. Sometimes they were allowed on top of the prison walls, but by and large executions moved behind prison walls to stop this rowdy behaviour. You also get new methods of execution during this time. So in the 1780s you get what is known as the new drop. This is where the condemned offender would fall through a trapdoor in order to instantly break their neck. In previous time periods, the condemned person would have slowly suffocated, but now they are just having their necks instantly broken because it is considered more humane, and there is no longer the march through the streets before the public execution takes place, because it's now either on top of the prison walls or behind the prison walls. In the 1870s then, you also get the development of the long drop. Now this is developed by a man called William Marwood, who is one of the chief executioners in England at the time, and he calculates the length of rope required to snap a neck instantly. Again, this is considered more humane because it would lead to a quicker death than strangulation. You also get a huge reduction in hangings during this time period, due to the Enlightenment period that we talked about in the first video for the industrial era. So people are starting to consider that executions perhaps are not the best way of punishing offenders, and perhaps we should instead focus on reforming and rehabilitating them rather than just outright removing them. And there is evidence for this in the statistics. So between 1800 and 1809 there are 871 executions, but 30 years later, in 1830 to 1839, you get 297. And like I said, that's largely due to the Enlightenment period, changing people's attitudes towards criminals. There are also fewer crimes punishable by death. So as I've mentioned, in the early modern period, you get a rapid rise and increase in the number of crimes punishable by death. The authorities reverse that in the industrial period. By 1837, only murder and attempted murder are punishable by death. Some of the crimes that are no longer punishable by death during this time period include forgery, sheep and cattle stealing, as well as letter opening. They are all no longer punishable by death. The next punishment that we need to have a look at then is transportation. Now it's important that you know transportation did take place in the end of the early modern period. It's not brand new to industrial Britain. Criminals had been sent to a foreign country in the previous time period to try and remove that criminal class. However, the country that they had been sent to was America. However, there are changes to transportation during this time period because the government in America get their independence from the British Empire, so they turn around and they say to the British government, we no longer want your criminals, you need to send them elsewhere. So the British government decide to send them to Australia. So that's the first big change in terms of transportation. During this time period, 160,000 petty criminals, and this is largely the crime that was punished through transportation, were sent to Australia. The reason that this was used as a punishment was because Australia was largely unknown at the time. It is not the holiday destination that we all know it is today, back in the industrial period, and it had very harsh conditions. For example, you would also be expected to do forced labour there. If you refused, you would be whipped, and whilst you were over there, you would complete this forced labour in chains and under supervision. So all of this added up to try and make a deterrent against petty crime. However, during the 1830s, you get opposition to transportation as a method of punishment. Humanitarians argue that it's unfair to send a criminal to the other side of the world for the rest of their lives, Sometimes they would be there for 7 years, 14 years, or could be there for their entire lives, like I've just said. Ratepayers, so those who paid tax in England, argued against transportation because they argued that if you sent a man who was often the breadwinner for families at this time to the other side of the world, it would be up to them to support the family that were left behind. Some argued that it was a soft option because they would get the opportunity to start a new life over there once they had finished their served time doing forced labour. And the Australian government, just like the American government a couple of hundred years before, turn around and say that they don't want criminals either from Britain. So it's banned in 1868. It's no longer used as a method of punishment in 1868. In terms of changes to prisons then, we'll start off with continuity. In 1750, prisons are still cramped, they're insanitary, so they're not in good conditions, and they're still run by a jailer for money, which of course is of the detriment to the poorest criminals who are sentenced to a prison sentence. But you get lots of change in prisons during this time. It is during this time period that prisons become the main form of punishment for offenders. In the early modern and medieval times, jails had just been used to hold prisoners awaiting trial or those who were in debt. However, now they become the main form of punishment. Attitudes also start to change towards prisons in the 1770s. You get a man called John Howard, who writes a book called The State of Prisons. And it is during in this book that he campaigns for abolishing the Discharge Act. So prisoners would have to pay a fee if they when their time served was up, which meant that they could leave prison. But of course, if you were poor, you could not afford to pay this fee. Therefore, even if you had served your time, you could not leave prison. And he also argued that jailers should be paid a salary rather than relying on the criminals to pay them. And each prisoner should have their own cell, should have their own healthcare. So basically encouraging better conditions for prisoners at the time. You also, 30 years later, get a woman called Elizabeth Fry, who is a Quaker, which is a member of a Christian movement. And she goes to Newgate Women's Prison, and she looks at the conditions that the women are in there, and she says that they're overcrowded, that they're unsanitary, that women need their own sections to look after their children if they've got children there, and she establishes a school and as well to try and give skills to the female prisoners so that when they leave they don't have to resort to crime. So these are two examples of campaigners and reformers who try to improve prisons during this time. You also get the 1823 Jail Act. This forces JPs, Justices of Peace, to visit and report on prisons to make sure that they are in good condition, and it also establishes categories of prisoners. So for example, those who had committed the most serious crimes such as murder would be kept away and imprisoned in separate areas to those who had committed petty crimes, to try and stop that school of prison sort of radicalizing the less petty criminals. The act also made female supervisors for female prisoners to stop sexual assaults occurring in prisons, and lastly it also encouraged separate cells to try and break prisoners up. But all of this is costly, so it's not implemented on the scale that it should have been. In 1842, you get what is known as Pentonville Prison, and this is considered a model prison, what other prisons should look like. It is here that they have the separate system in which prisoners were kept apart from each other to reflect on their own crimes. However, this often had the downside of that it led to loneliness and mental breakdowns. From the 1850s, you get the silent system, which is used instead. This is where prisoners were allowed to work alongside each other, but they were not allowed to speak to each other. And they were also given very meaningless tasks to complete. For example, the crank, where they would turn a handle, which had no purpose, and where they would also walk on a treadmill. And all of that was to try and deter criminals from committing crimes again and seeing them landed back in prison. You then, in the 1860s, get what is known as called a garroting panic. This is where there were reports that in London people were being strangled to death, and it leads to a mass sort of hysteria. So from the early 1860s, prisons were made harsher. You get the 1865 Prisons Act, which emphasises hard labour, hard fare and hard board. This brutal system stays in place for 30 years. It has flogging of prisoners, and it's trying to again deter criminals from committing crimes by making prisons as harsh as possible. So even though you get all of these moves towards actually rehabilitating and making prisons better places for criminals to try and stop them from committing crimes again, towards the end of the period in the 1860s, you get a bit of a reversal of that because people are panicking and they want prisons to suddenly become these harsh places again. The Enlightenment period that we've talked about in previous videos massively influences the way that we look at punishments in the industrial period. There is that move towards reform and rehabilitation rather than just retribution, so revenge, and removing the criminal class that had been the focus of punishments in the early modern and the medieval period. So this is a time of huge change in terms of punishment of offenders as well. That wraps up the industrial period. In the next few videos, we'll be looking at the changes to crime, law enforcement and punishment in the modern period.